This is the easier-to-read version of John Steinbeck's Of Mice and Men, retold and narrated by Sara Simpson. Chapter 1, Part 1. The Salinas River runs just south of Soledad, California. The water is deep, green, and warm. There is yellow sand on the river banks. On one side of the river, you can see the Gabilan Mountains. On the other side of the river, you can see willow trees and farmland. You can hear the sounds of animals in the brush: lizards, raccoons, deer, and rabbits. There is a path that goes from the river to the farmland. Over the years, lots of men have used the path to get to the river. The men work on the farms. They never stay in one place for very long. They always move on, trying to find work on the next farm, once the harvest season here is over. The men live in bunkhouses on the big ranches and farms nearby, and they like to come swim in the river on hot days. It had been a hot day, but it was evening now. The air was cooler now that the sun was going down. The rabbits came out to drink from the river. They sat quietly on the banks until they heard the sound of two men walking down the path. When they heard the men, they ran back into their holes to hide. The two men both wore matching jeans, coats, and hats. They both carried bags over their shoulders with blankets and other supplies inside. The first man was small and quick. He had a serious face with sharp, strong features. His eyes were always looking around. He noticed everything. Every part of him was defined: small, strong hands, slender arms, a thin and bony nose. The other man was completely different. He was huge. He had a soft, shapeless face. He had big eyes that didn't pay attention to anything except for the small man walking in front of him. He dragged his feet when he walked the way a bear drags its paws. The big man seemed more like a child than an adult. The small man stopped to wipe the sweat from his face. The big man ran over to the water and put his head in it to cool off. He drank with long gulps, snorting into the water like a horse. The small man tried to stop him. "Lenny," the small man said to the big man, "don't drink so much. You know what happens when you drink too much water too fast. You get sick to your stomach. Do you want to throw up again like you did last night?" Lenny put his head under the water again. He was still wearing his hat. When he pulled his head out of the water, it dripped down his face. He smiled at the small man. "You should drink some, George," the big man said to the small man. "You take a good big drink." "I don't know if that water's safe," George said to Lenny. "That water looks dirty." Lenny wasn't listening. He was using his hand to make ripples in the water. "Look what I did," Lenny said, pointing to the ripples in the water. George took a small drink of water. "I think it's safe," George said. "It tastes clean. But, Lenny, you shouldn't drink water unless you're sure it's clean. We've talked about this before, but you can't remember. You'd drink out of the street gutter if you were thirsty. You never stop to think before you do something." George sat down on the riverbank. He put his arms around his knees and looked around at the trees. Lenny watched George and sat exactly the same way, with his arms around his knees. He looked over to George to see if he had it just right. He pulled his hat down a little more over his eyes, the way George's hat was. George was in a bad mood. It had been a long day of traveling in the heat. "That bastard bus driver," George said. "He knew he was making us get out 4 miles from the ranch. He just didn't want to drive all the way there. He lied to us. Told us the ranch was just down a bit down the road. Damn hot day." Lenny didn't like it when George was in a bad mood. It upset him. "George," Lenny asked, "where are we going?" "Did you forget where we're going already?" George asked. "Do I have to tell you again, you crazy bastard?" "I tried not to forget," Lenny said sadly. "Okay, I'll tell you again," George said. "I guess I ain't got nothing else to do except tell you things so you can forget 'em again." "I tried and tried to remember," Lenny said. "I forgot where we're going, but I always remember about the rabbits." You can't remember anything except the rabbits, George said, annoyed. This time, make sure you listen. If you don't listen and pay attention, we'll get in trouble when we get to the ranch. Think real hard, Lenny. Where are we going? I ain't sure, Lenny said. We went to the work agency, Murray and Reddy, and George started, waiting to see if Lenny could remember the rest. We got work tickets that told us to go work on a ranch, Lenny shouted, proud to remember. Lenny felt in all of his pockets, looking for his work ticket. It wasn't there. I lost it, Lenny cried. I have your work ticket, George said. Do you think I'd let you hold on to your own work ticket? There was something in one of Lenny's pockets that he kept stopping to touch. What's in your pocket? George asked sharply. Lenny took whatever it was in his pocket and hid it in his huge hand. I ain't got nothing in my pocket, George, Lenny said sneakily. I know, it's in your hand now. Stop trying to be sneaky, George said. Let me see what you have. It's only a mouse, George, Lenny said. A live mouse? George asked. No, just a dead mouse, Lenny said. But I didn't kill it. It was dead when I found it. I just wanted to pet it while we were walking along. Mouses are soft. I like to pet things that are soft. Give it to me, George said. You know you can't keep a dead mouse. Dead things start to smell bad and it could make you sick. Lenny sadly gave the dead mouse to George. George threw the dead mouse as far across the river as he could. Okay, let's practice again, George said. Lenny, where are we going? Lenny looked upset. I forgot again, Lenny said. Jesus Christ, George said, frustrated. We're going to work on another ranch. It's like the ranch we worked on up north before in that town called Weed. I remember the ranch in Weed, Lenny said proudly. Stay focused, George said. Tomorrow we're going to the new ranch. Right before we get there, I'll give you your work ticket. I'll keep it until then so you can't lose it. When we get to the ranch, I'm going to do all the talking. You just stand there and don't say nothing. If the owner of the ranch sees how dumb you are, he'll fire us before we even start. If he sees you work before he hears you talk, we're set. Understand? Yes, George, Lenny said seriously. He didn't want to disappoint George. One more time, George said to Lenny. When we get to the ranch, what are you going to do? Lenny scrunched up his face, thinking hard, trying to remember. Lenny started, then remembered. I ain't going to say nothing. Good job, George said. I want you to say that to yourself 3 more times so you don't forget. I ain't going to say nothing. I ain't going to say nothing. I ain't going to say nothing, Lenny said, concentrating. Good, George said. And you ain't going to do no bad things like you done in Weed, neither. I did bad things, Lenny said, confused. You forgot that too, George said. I'm not going to remind you. I'm scared if I remind you, it'll make you do it again. Lenny thought hard, then smiled proudly. I remember Weed, Lenny shouted. Those men run us out of Weed. We ran, George said disgustedly. Those men were looking for us, but they didn't catch us. Lenny giggled. He sounded like a child. I didn't forget that, Lenny said. George lay down and crossed his hands behind his head. Lenny did the same thing, making sure he did it exactly like George. God, you're a lot of trouble, said George. I could get along so easy and so nice if I didn't have you. Life would be easy. I could have a girlfriend if you weren't around. Lenny was quiet. It made him sad when George talked about how easy life would be if he were gone. We're going to work on a ranch, George, Lenny said, trying to make George proud by showing him he could remember. Yeah, that's right, George said, but not until tomorrow. Tonight we're going to sleep here by the river. Why are we going to sleep here, George? Lenny asked. Ain't we going to go to the ranch tonight? They got supper at the ranch. I like it here, George said. It's nice here. It's quiet. We'll be working hard in the field tomorrow. Tonight I just want to lay here and look at the stars. Ain't we going to have no supper? Lenny asked. Yes, we're going to have supper, George said. Go get some firewood. We'll get a fire started. Once it's hot enough, we'll make some beans for supper. I've got a can of beans in my bag. I like beans with ketchup, Lenny said happily. We ain't got no ketchup, George said. Hurry up, go get that firewood. It's going to be dark soon. Lenny went off to look for firewood. Poor bastard, George said to himself quietly. Lenny came back a minute later. He was carrying one small stick. He gave the stick to George, then turned away. He had something in his pocket. George knew Lenny had the dead mouse. He'd gone across the river to find it and put it back in his pocket. George sighed. Gimme the mouse, George said. I ain't got no mouse, Lenny said, pretending not to know what George was talking about. George sighed again. You went and found the one I threw across the river. I know that's why you went over there and only came back with one stick, George said. George put out his hand. Gimme the mouse. You know you can't keep a dead mouse. It's not healthy, George said to Lenny. Lenny started to cry. George felt bad. Lenny, don't cry, George said. I'm not trying to take away the mouse to be mean. The mouse is dead. It's not fresh. I'll let you get another mouse, one that's alive. If you'll be gentle, you can keep it, pet it. Lenny gave the dead mouse to George. I don't know why I can't keep it, Lenny said. I didn't kill it. I found it on the road when we were walking. I just wanted to pet it. I like the soft fur. Lenny was crying. Stop crying, George yelled. A big guy like you shouldn't be crying like a baby. I don't know where I'll get another mouse, Lenny cried. There used to be a lady who gave me mice to play with, but I don't remember the lady's name. That lady was your Aunt Clara, George said. Did you forget your aunt's name? Lenny cried harder. You forgot, George said. Your Aunt Clara stopped giving you mice because you'd pet 'em too hard and kill 'em. I know you didn't mean to do it. You don't know how strong you are. I didn't mean to kill 'em, Lenny said sadly. They was so little. I just wanted to pet them because they were soft. Someday maybe I can get a rabbit to pet. A rabbit ain't as little as a mouse. I could pet it harder and it wouldn't die. Aunt Clara gave you a toy mouse, George said. Maybe we can get you a toy mouse to pet. A toy mouse isn't soft, Lenny cried. George turned away from Lenny. He reached into his bag and got out 2 cans of beans. Maybe food would distract Lenny from thinking about the mouse. Maybe food would get him to stop crying. Why don't you go get that firewood, George said patiently. Once we've got the fire going, we can warm up these beans and eat some supper. I'll bet you feel better once you eat some supper. I like beans with ketchup, Lenny said, pouting. George was out of patience. We ain't got no ketchup, George shouted. Whatever we ain't got, that's what you want. I'm doing the best I can. If I was by myself, life would be so easy. Lenny cried harder. George was yelling. He hated it when George yelled. But what do I have? George yelled. I have you. That's all I have. You ruin everything. I don't have a girlfriend. I don't have my own house. I have to take care of you all the time because you can't take care of yourself. You do stupid things and get us both in trouble. You don't mean to do it, but you get in trouble all the time. And I'm the one who has to figure out what to do because you can't. I'm the one who has to be responsible for everything because you're too stupid to remember anything. Lenny was crying even harder. You don't remember why we had to run away from Weed, but I do, George shouted. You wanted to touch that girl's dress because it was soft. You touched it, and when she said to stop, you panicked. You held onto her dress, and she started to scream. She didn't understand that you didn't know any better. She didn't understand that you're more like a kid than an adult. She didn't know that you weren't trying to hurt her. She just saw a big man grabbing her dress and screamed. She thought you were going to rape her. Then the men in town came to see what she was screaming about. They saw you. They didn't understand. You panicked. They didn't know you wouldn't hurt that girl. They chased us both. We had to hide in the bushes outside of town until they went away so they wouldn't kill you. And that is how we ended up here. Lenny's eyes were wide with fear. He hated it when George was angry with him. He didn't understand why George was angry with him. George, Lenny said very quietly. I didn't really want any ketchup for my beans. I was just kidding. George wasn't angry anymore. He felt bad that he'd lost his temper with Lenny. He knew Lenny didn't understand he'd done anything wrong. If I had some ketchup, you could have it, George said. Even if we had some, I wouldn't eat any of it, Lenny said. I'd save all of it for you. George felt guilty. Lenny loved him, and he'd lost his temper with him. George stared at the fire sadly. Sometimes I think about how easy my life would be if I didn't have you with me, George said. I could go away, Lenny said. Where would you go? George said, annoyed again. I could go find a cave in the mountains, Lenny said. I could go live by myself in a cave. What would you eat? George asked, getting more annoyed. I'd find things to eat, Lenny said sadly. I'd like it all by myself. If I found a mouse, I could keep it. Nobody would take it away from me. I was mean, George said. I didn't mean to get mad at you. I didn't mean what I said about not wanting to have you around. I want you to stay with me. Lenny could tell that George felt guilty, so he knew it was a good time to ask George to tell him a story. George always told him the same story, and Lenny never got tired of it. Tell me about the farm we're going to have someday, Lenny said. George smiled. He liked to tell the story as much as Lenny liked to hear it. Okay, I'll tell you about the farm, George said. George's voice became deeper. He repeated his words rhythmically, as though he'd said them many times before. Guys like us, guys that work on ranches, are the loneliest guys in the world. They got no family. They don't belong no place. They come to a ranch and earn money, and then they go into town and spend it all on drinking and gambling. They don't think about the future. They never have a real home. Yes, that's the story, Lenny said, happy. Tell about us now, George. Tell about how we're not like those guys. George went on. With us, it ain't like that. We got a future. We got somebody to talk to that gives a damn about us. We don't have to go out drinking at a bar. They're always alone, but not us. Because I got you and you got me, Lenny interrupted excitedly. Keep Joe and George. Tell the next part. You know it by heart, George said, smiling. You can tell me this time. No, you tell it, Lenny said. I forget some of the parts. Tell how it's going to be when we get our own farm. Someday, we'll save up enough money to get our own place, George said. We'll have a little house and a couple of acres. We'll have a cow and some pigs and live off the fat of the land, Lenny shouted, repeating the words George had said dozens of times before. And we'll have rabbits. Tell the part about the garden and the vegetables. Tell about the rabbits in a warm little cage in the yard. Tell about how it'll rain in the winter. Tell how thick the cream is on the milk. Tell about that, George. Why don't you tell it? George said, laughing. You know the whole story. No, you tell it, Lenny said. I like it better when you tell the story. Tell about the part how I'll get to take care of the rabbits. We'll have a big vegetable garden, George went on. We'll have a rabbit hutch. We'll have chickens. When it's cold and rainy in the winter, we'll make a big fire in the stove. We'll sit by the fire and listen to the rain on the roof. We'll be safe and warm. George felt himself getting emotional thinking about the farm. He thought he might cry because it was such a beautiful dream. That's enough stories for now, George said. Let's warm up these beans on the fire and eat some supper. They sat together and ate the beans. A few beans fell out of Lenny's mouth while he was eating. Lenny didn't notice. George wiped the beans off Lenny's shirt. Okay, let's practice again, George said. When we get to the ranch tomorrow, what are you gonna do? Lenny stopped chewing and thought as hard as he could. Lenny started, then remembered. I ain't gonna say a word. Good job, Lenny, George said. You're getting better at remembering things. If you're this good at remembering things, you'll get to take care of the rabbits on the farm for sure. Lenny was proud of himself for remembering. He was happy that George was proud of him, too. Lenny, I need you to remember another thing, George said. I need you to pay attention and really listen to me. Lenny nodded. Look around at where we are right now, George said. If something happens and you get into trouble, I want you to come here. Just follow the river here. I'll come find you. I can remember, Lenny said. If you get in trouble, I want you to come here and hide in the brush, George said. Just hide in the bushes so nobody can see you and wait for me to come. Hide in the brush, Lenny repeated. Wait for you to come. One more time, George said. Hide in the brush, wait for me to come. Hide in the brush, wait for you to come, Lenny said. But you're not going to get in any trouble, right? George said. You're not going to need to hide and wait for me, are you? I'm not going to get in no trouble, Lenny said. Okay, we need to get some sleep, George said. Let's lay down by the fire and rest. We have to get up early tomorrow to go to work on the ranch. They lay quietly for a while. George, are you asleep? Lenny whispered. Nope, I'm awake. What do you want? George asked. Let's have different color rabbits, Lenny said. Okay, we'll have different color rabbits, George said sleepily. We'll have red ones and green ones and blue ones. We'll have a million rabbits. Let's have furry ones like we saw at the fair that one time, Lenny said. Sure, furry ones, George said, starting to fall asleep. If we don't have rabbits, I can go away and live in a cave, Lenny said. George laughed. You ain't gonna go live in a cave, George said. You're gonna live with me. Now shut up and go to sleep.
Thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe and click on the link for more resources from Enraged2Engaged.